On April 17, 2026, standing on the south lawn of the White House before boarding Marine One, Donald Trump said something that stopped every intelligence analyst in Washington cold. He said Iran had agreed to hand over what he called nuclear dust. He said they had agreed, in his words, very powerfully. He said the United States would work with Iran to dig up and remove all of the deeply buried material from facilities that American B-2 bombers had struck in June 2025. He said they had agreed to almost everything, and then he flew to Las Vegas. Iran did not confirm it. Iran's foreign ministry said the enriched uranium will under no circumstances be transferred anywhere. Iran's atomic energy chief said Iran will not accept limits on its enrichment, and yet something had shifted because in the days surrounding that announcement, if you know where to look, the picture that emerges is not simply a diplomatic development. It is one of the most extraordinary internal power struggles in the history of the Islamic Republic, playing out in real time, in public, with the fate of 440 kilograms of weapons-grade uranium at the center of it. Let me tell you what actually happened, not the press release version, the real version. Start with the uranium itself, because you need to understand what Trump was claiming Iran had agreed to surrender before you can understand why the claim is so significant and why the IRGC's reaction to it tells you more about where this war is heading than any official statement from either government. By June 2025, Iran had accumulated 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity. For context, weapons-grade uranium requires enrichment to 90%. The technical step from 60% to 90% is, in the language of nuclear physics, relatively small. The IAEA confirmed in December 2024 that this stockpile represented an unprecedented accumulation without a credible civilian purpose, giving Iran the capacity to produce enough fissile material for multiple nuclear warheads on short notice. What the nuclear establishment calls breakout time, the gap between a political decision to build a weapon and the technical capacity to detonate one, had collapsed to something approaching zero. For Israel, this was an existential nightmare with a running clock. For the United States, it was the specific threat that justified every escalatory step of Operation Epic Fury. For Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey, each of which had privately communicated that a nuclear-capable Tehran would trigger their own programs, it was the trigger for the most dangerous proliferation cascade in the post-Hiroshima era. The June 2025 American airstrikes using B-2 Spirit bombers and GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators hit Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. Fordow, built entirely inside a mountain, was always the hardest target. The strikes severely damaged the centrifuge infrastructure at all three facilities. But here is the thing that every intelligence briefing since June 2025 has had to acknowledge: the strikes destroyed the machines. They did not destroy the material. Uranium enriched to 60% does not degrade. It does not become inert. It does not lose its weapons relevance over time. Properly recovered and processed, it remains usable for centuries. The infrastructure can be rebuilt around it. The program can reconstitute. This is why Trump, on April 8th at the Ceasefire press conference, made a specific and unusual statement. He said there will be no enrichment of uranium, and the United States will, working with Iran, dig up and remove all of the deeply buried nuclear dust. That sentence was not diplomatic boilerplate. It was a specific operational claim about a specific physical objective. And then 9 days later, on April 17th, he said Iran had agreed to it very powerfully. Now, here is where the story fractures into the two parallel realities that have defined this entire crisis. Because simultaneously with Trump's announcement, inside Tehran, a power struggle of historic proportions was reaching its climax. IRGC Commander Ahmad Vahidi had been executing what the Institute for the Study of War called, in a published assessment, a slow-motion seizure of state power. Iran International, the opposition-aligned outlet with the deepest sourcing inside the IRGC, reported on April 1st that Vahidi and the IRGC had blocked presidential appointments and decisions while erecting a security perimeter around the core of power, effectively sidelining the government from executive control. Vahidi had forced President Pezeshkian to accept Mohammad Bagher Zolgadar as Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council, the body that coordinates Iran's war and negotiation strategy, over Pezeshkian's explicit objection. Zolgadar is, by Pezeshkian's own account, the principal obstacle to ceasefire negotiations. When Foreign Minister Araghchi announced on April 17th that the Strait of Hormuz would be reopened to commercial shipping, IRGC-affiliated media attacked him within hours. The Strait did not reopen. Vahidi's faction overrode IRGC's announcement by lunchtime. Fox News and Euronews both reported on April 22nd, citing Iran International and Western intelligence assessments, that Vahidi had declared under wartime conditions all critical positions must be chosen and managed directly by the Revolutionary Guard until further notice. A Western intelligence assessment quoted by Euronews on April 22nd used language that should stop anyone following this story. What is taking shape in Iran is no longer an Islamic republic in its original sense, but a military junta in every respect. The ISW concluded that Vahidi and his inner circle have likely secured at least temporary control over not only Iran's military response, but the entire decision-making architecture of the regime. IRGC is the foreign minister. Pezeshkian is the elected president. Both of them have been publicly overruled repeatedly by an IRGC commander who carries an active Interpol red notice for the 1994 AMIA bombing in Buenos Aires that killed 85 people. That is who is functionally running Iran right now. And that man's position on the nuclear handover, according to a source close to the IRGC cited by Channel 14, is that there is no need to rush into a deal. He believes Trump will eventually back down. He does not believe Trump's threshold for resuming full-scale strikes is as low as Trump's public rhetoric suggests. So place Trump's April 17th announcement into this context and ask the question that nobody in the press conference wanted to ask directly: who exactly agreed, and do they have the authority to make the agreement stick? Pezeshkian wanted a deal. IRGC was negotiating for a deal. Ghalibaf led the delegation in Islamabad that came within an inch of a deal. All three of those men have been publicly overruled, humiliated, or potentially detained. There were unconfirmed reports on April 20th from a source cited in the All Israel News report that Ghalibaf, Pezeshkian, and IRGC had been placed under house arrest, reports that have not been independently verified but have not been denied either. Vahidi, the man who actually controls the military infrastructure, the facilities, the guards, the centrifuges, and the buried uranium, has not confirmed anything. His faction has denied everything. The Institute for the Study of War published an assessment noting that the IRGC's actions are likely intended to be an internal demonstration of power designed to exhibit the IRGC's control within the regime, and in particular, its control over Iran's negotiating policy. That sentence matters enormously. If the IRGC's goal is to demonstrate that it controls negotiating policy, then any agreement signed by the civilian government is, by definition, an agreement the IRGC has not authorized. And any agreement the IRGC has not authorized is an agreement that cannot be physically implemented, because the IRGC is the entity that controls the physical facilities where the uranium is stored. CNN reported on April 20th, citing Trump officials who acknowledged privately that the president's public commentary has been detrimental to talks, noting the sensitivity of the negotiations and the Iranians' deep mistrust of the U.S. Iranian officials outwardly rejected many of Trump's assertions. The Washington Post reported that Iran handing over its uranium stockpile would mark a significant step, but less so if Iran was still able to enrich uranium, even from a very low starting point. The specific negotiating gap that CNN described is telling. During the first round of talks, the U.S. proposed a 20-year pause on Iranian enrichment. Iran countered with 5 years. Iran then moved to a proposal for a 10-year pause, followed by another decade of enrichment, only to levels well below weapons grade. Trump has said publicly he does not like even the 20-year pause. He does not want Iran to feel like they have a win. He wants no enrichment indefinitely, and the head of Iran's Atomic Energy Organization has said Iran will not accept limits on its nuclear enrichment. So the specific gap between these positions is not a small gap. It is a chasm between permanent zero enrichment on the American side and continued enrichment rights on the Iranian side, with the IRGC holding the actual physical leverage over any implementation of either position. Now, here's the dimension of this story that the reference script identified correctly and that deserves the most careful examination. What does the IRGC actually do if a deal is signed by the civilian government? It has three options. Accept the handover. This means institutional suicide for the organization that built its entire political identity around protecting the nuclear program. The IRGC's claim to budgets, to authority, to the loyalty of its own officers rests on the narrative of unbreakable resistance. The uranium is not just a weapons asset, it is the physical embodiment of that narrative. Handing it to American inspectors means handing over the story the IRGC has been telling itself and the Iranian people since 1979. But a regime that accepts humiliation still exists. And existence is a platform from which power can eventually rebuild. Sabotage the deal, move material to undeclared locations, delay inspections, claim compliance while maintaining a concealed reserve. This is technically feasible. The IAEA has consistently documented that Iran's declared nuclear activities do not account for all of Iran's nuclear activities. There are facilities the inspectors have never seen. Material can be moved before any handover process begins. The risk is that Trump concludes Iran is not complying and executes every option on the table simultaneously, resuming strikes, intensifying the blockade, and potentially authorizing the ground operation plan that defense officials called a logistics nightmare more complex than Normandy. Stage a full internal coup, remove Pezeshkian and Aragchi entirely, end the diplomatic process, and dare Washington to respond. This hands the entire Iranian state to the organization whose strategy has produced the current catastrophe. It removes the last faction arguing for regime preservation through negotiation. The IRGC's calculation on which of these three options is least damaging to its own survival is the calculation that will determine whether Trump's April 17th announcement means anything at all. And that calculation is being made right now, inside a regime that has no functioning supreme leader, a civilian government that has been locked out of decision-making, an economy that Iranian President Pezeshkian himself warned would completely collapse within 3 weeks, and an IRGC commander who believes Trump will back down. The most honest thing I can say about the current status of Iran's nuclear concession is this. Trump said Iran agreed. Iran's civilian leadership, to the extent it still functions, appears to have agreed. The IRGC, which controls the uranium, has not agreed. There is no agreement that can be physically implemented without the IRGC, and the IRGC is led by a man who thinks the clock is on his side. One of those two assessments is wrong. The entire outcome of this war depends on which one, because power in Iran does not reside in statements, it resides in control. Control of men, weapons, territory, and in this case, uranium that has been buried, shielded, and protected precisely for this moment. The IRGC is not a political faction in the Western sense. It is a parallel state, a military, economic, intelligence structure that has embedded itself into every critical part of Iran's system. When pressure comes, it does not negotiate, it consolidates. And that is what is happening now under fire. So when analysts in Washington heard Trump say Iran had agreed very powerfully, what stood out was not the claim itself, but what it implied. Either the IRGC had accepted a strategic concession that contradicts its entire ideological foundation, or the United States is negotiating with actors who do not actually control the state they represent. There is no comfortable middle ground. The American strikes in June 2025 did more than damage infrastructure. They shifted internal power inside Iran. Before them, the civilian leadership still had space to negotiate and balance pressure. After them, that space collapsed and survival logic took over. In that environment, power moves toward whoever controls force. That is the IRGC. The sidelining of figures like Pezeshkian and Aragchi is not just political disagreement. It reflects a system shifting from hybrid governance to coercive military dominance. The phrase military junta becomes less metaphor and more description of how decisions are now made. And that matters because the uranium is not symbolic. It is physical material controlled by IRGC-linked structures. Any handover would require operational access the civilian government does not have. So the key question is simple. Who actually agreed? If Pezeshkian agreed, it has political meaning but no enforcement power. If Aragchi agreed, it reflects diplomacy but not control. Neither commands the system that holds the uranium. That control sits with the IRGC leadership. and they have not confirmed anything. Now, the logic inside that leadership becomes critical. The IRGC is not reacting emotionally. It is calculating. It is asking whether the United States will truly escalate or eventually back down. If it believes Washington will hesitate, delay becomes strategy. Stall talks, deny terms, wait. But if it miscalculates, the consequences are severe because the United States has already shown willingness to strike directly at nuclear infrastructure. That creates a dangerous loop of misreading intent on both sides. One side believes pressure will force compliance. The other believes pressure will fade. Both cannot be right. The core dispute is not technical, it is strategic. The United States demands zero enrichment. Iran, or more precisely its military core, sees enrichment as essential to survival and deterrence. That gap is not negotiable in small steps. It is structural. This conflict is structural. Regionally, Israel sees time as critical because the difference between 60% and 90% enrichment is the difference between potential capability and immediate threat. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey see a different danger, a regional cascade of nuclear ambitions if Iran crosses the threshold. So the stakes extend far beyond Iran itself. Internally, Iran is under severe strain. Economic pressure, sanctions, and internal division have weakened civilian authority. The IRGC now carries not just power, but responsibility for outcomes. That makes its position more complex. It's a complex position. Rejecting a deal risks escalation. Accepting one risks internal legitimacy. Manipulating compliance risks war if detected. None of these options are low risk. Every option is high risk. That is why this is not a stable negotiation, but a branching crisis. Every path carries escalation potential. Every single path. And at the center is one unresolved question. Does the IRGC believe the United States will follow through? If it believes no, it can continue to resist and wait. If it believes yes, it may be forced into partial compromise or internal consolidation. Right now, both sides are operating on assumptions about the other that may be wrong. That is the most dangerous condition in any confrontation because it means escalation is not planned, it is triggered. So when Trump says Iran agreed, it should not be understood as resolution. It is the beginning of a more unstable phase, a very unstable phase. Agreements that cannot be enforced become pressure points, not solutions. They create deadlines, expectations, and triggers for action. And there is still no evidence that the IRGC is preparing to physically surrender the material or allow external verification at the level required. The uranium remains where it is, controlled by the only institution that can enforce or block any deal. Until that changes, nothing else in the diplomatic process matters in a practical sense. Because in the end, this entire crisis reduces to a single question: who controls the material and what do they believe about the consequences of holding it? Right now, that answer remains the IRGC, and they are still acting as if time is on their side.